Hello, welcome after a tumultuous few days which saw a meltdown in relations between Ukraine and the US. President Zelensky has again called for effective security guarantees from its allies in order to stop Russian attacks posting on social media. In just the past hour, he said that the targeting of his country with thousands of attack drones, aerial bombs and missiles over the past week alone shows that the Kremlin does not want to end the war. Now it follows Sunday's summit in London where European leaders discussed the best strategy to bring about a ceasefire host. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that any future deal must respect Ukrainian sovereignty, as he unveiled a 4-point plan for peace. Well, after the meeting, President Zelensky sat down with journalists before returning to Kyiv. Our political correspondent, Joe Pike, reports the visit to Sandringham went better than Washington last night. Volodymyr Zelensky visited King Charles at the end of a bruising week before returning to Kyiv. He sat down with journalists. I traveled in the train for 12 hours. Then, for 11 hours, I flew. Because the President of the United States invited me now. But how can he restore relations with the White House? You're gambling with the lives of millions of people you're gambling with. World War II this weekend. He avoided apologizing or explaining exactly what happened after that office encounter. I think we'll leave this for history. President Zelensky said it was too early to talk concessions. He implied Ukraine could survive without us support, and had he heard of a reported French plan for a 1-month truce in the air and at sea? I'm aware of everything earlier. Kama hosted European leaders in London to form a coalition of the willings, nations prepared to guarantee security if a peace deal is struck. We are at a crossroads in history today. This is not a moment for more talk. It's time to act. Those willing will intensify planning now, with real urgency. The UK has prepared to back, this with boots on the ground and planes in the air. Together with others, Europe must do the heavy lifting, but to support peace in our continent, and to succeed, this effort must have strongest backing. European countries did commit. We don't know which ones or what they promised, but the EU plans to rearm. As a matter of urgency, it's basically turning Ukraine into a steeled porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders. These leaders want to play a part in a Ukrainian peace deal. It's still clear if President Trump will let them. Joe Pike, BBC News Westminster. Well, a Kremlin spokesperson said that efforts in London to increase funding to Kyiv will not help bring about a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, is in Moscow and told us how Sunday's summit is being viewed by the government. There, the reaction here so far has been pretty dismissive. I have to say, judging by what the Russian papers are saying this morning, I read through the papers, earlier today, and jotted down some of the top lines, just to give you a flavor of how this is going down in Moscow. So one PRR in tabloid this morning says the Europeans met in London to flog a dead horse. Another Prover paper says this. In 3 years, Europe produced nothing to back up their slogan. We're with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Without the US, they can't even give Ukrainians security guarantees. And the government paper this morning here says, in words, Europe declares, it will never abandon Ukraine in reality. It doesn't have the resources to replace America. So I think that's pretty clear. Moscow is portraying this European initiative as a non-starter. But there's more to this story, because the last thing I think Russia wants right now is for Europe to come in and to strengthen Ukraine before any peace talks, and to shape the peace agreement. So it's not taking any chances. And from what the media's been saying this morning, from what Russian officials were hinting at last night, it's clear that Moscow is trying to portray the London summit as an anti-Trump initiative. An anti-Trump event. That phrase, anti-Trump, has popped up several times over the last few hours. And I think this shows that Moscow wants to send a message to the White House to say, President Trump, those Europeans are against you. You're better off dealing directly with Russia on the Ukrainian situation. Steve Rosenberg with the perspective from the Kremlin. Well, the UK's ambassador to the US, Lord Mandelson, has suggested in a television interview that Ukraine should commit to a ceasefire before Russia. However, a UK defense minister appeared to contradict the ambassador. describing his comments as not government policy. Well, our political correspondent Ian Watson explains this latest development. The summit, of course, was talking very much about security guarantees, but also stepping up European defense spending. Also putting Ukraine in the strongest possible position ahead of any peace talks should they occur. But what Peter Manderson, the UK ambassador to Washington, was saying on the American network ABC yesterday was there needed to be a radical reset of relations between President Zelensky and President Trump. And clearly one way of doing that, he suggested, was for Ukraine to commit to a ceasefire and defy the Russians to follow suit. There seems to be no sense at all that President Zelensky is interested in that. Without security guarantees, and this morning the Armed Forces Minister Luke Pardon on the BBC made it very clear that this was not something which he saw as government policy. In other words, it sounded as though Lord Manderson was speaking without the authority of the government here. It still remains to be seen what happens next, though. Because the one word that in government seems to be saying to me this morning is fluid. The situation is very fluid. So will Keir Starmer. Talk to Donald Trump again. Quite soon will he join a summit of European leaders for further discussions on Thursday in Brussels. These questions still remain open, but as far as we are aware, from Luke Poe's contribution this morning, the government minister has been on the airwaves. Not only was he putting some distance between the government's position and what Lord Mandan was saying over the weekend, but he was also making it very clear that the U.S. still had to remain involved, that for credible security guarantees effectively to prevent or deter any future Russian aggression, there had to be some American backup, whether it's air defenses, whether it's intelligence, whether it's logistics, not boots on the ground. Europe would lead on that front. But he still wanted these US guarantees that still appears to be the American position, and certainly the Ukrainian position, is that they don't want to go into a ceasefire, which then allows the Russians to regroup without strong guarantees. From all that allies, and Ian Luke Pollard also talking about an idea which was put forward by the French, a potential, month-long truce between Russia and Ukraine. But, details so far, very scarce. Yes. Well, I think, from any of my contacts, with government, they are steering us very, very, clearly away from that particular proposal coming out of the summit. Of course, there's an agreement that Keir Starmer, the French president, would work closely together to try to come up with a ceasefire plan or a peace plan in conjunction with Vladimir Zelensky. Because, obviously, his relations with Donald Trump are not exactly optimal at the moment, so they would work in this and put this to the U.S. president. But this idea of a partial, month-long ceasefire is something which certainly isn't a UK initiative, and certainly hasn't been agreed between France and the UK. It would be a partial, ceasefire, which would not be a ceasefire along the very big front line. It would be a ceasefire in relation to sea movements, air movements, and also an agreement not to attack critical infrastructure. But that does not seem to be soaring very high at the moment in terms of the potential options which the European leaders are looking at. A lot to discuss by UKK News.